So again, aloha mai kākou. Today we have presentation by Zoe titled Strengthening Support for ʻŌiwi Agroforestry in Hawaii. And so Zoe, you may start whenever you're ready. Oh, you're muted.
Great start. Aloha mai kākou. Thank you all for being here today. Let me get my slides open and set up. Okay. Serena, you want to just confirm that you can see my presenter with the presentation?
I can see your presentation.
Okay,
It looks beautiful.
perfect. Thank you. Okay, aloha mai kākou. My name is Zoe Hastings Silao. I am a research social scientist at the Institute for Pacific Islands Forestry. And I'm relatively new to this position, but I've been working in Hawaii since 2016, and I'm originally from Wisconsin. My work in Hawaii through my dissertation research and some work as a technician before that has really focused on conservation and restoration, forest restoration, and particularly with communities. And so today I'm going to talk more about agroforestry, which is a form of forest that is tended by people. And so it might include products that people harvest and gather. And yeah, I'll take it from there. Some of the information I'll share today is from my dissertation research and postdoc, and then a lot of it continuing today. So I'm really fortunate that I get to do this work with the Forest Service and continue collaborations with all of the folks on this page and many more. So before I get too far into this, I really want to acknowledge that this work is been done by many folks together as a big team. And so a big part of this work is MΑLA ʻŌiwi and the agroforestry practitioners who I've interviewed and worked with. So they're pictured here. And then also an interdisciplinary team of researchers and support folks. And so you'll see pictured here Linnea Hu, which I'll talk more about her later, as our new MALA ʻŌiwi staff member. Dr. Tamara Tickton, Mai Wong, Leah Bremer, and Natalie Kirishima. So in the Pacific Islands, multiple stressors threaten food system resilience, or the ability for capacity over time to provide sufficient, appropriate, and acceptable food for all. And some of these stressors include climate change, invasive species, wildfire, and severe flooding. At the same time, there are major inequities in access to food, and in particular, Kanaka ʻŌiwi, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders face disproportionately high rates of food insecurity and a lack of food sovereignty. 1 in 5 Pacific Islanders in the US live in a food insecure household, compared to 1 in 11 white or non-Hispanic individuals and 1 in 17 Asian individuals. Over 80% of food consumed in Hawaii is imported, yet approximately 45% of agricultural land is fallow, and looks like the pictures here. Unmanaged agricultural lands are not only a lost opportunity for addressing food system resilience, food security, and food sovereignty, but also they're a major concern for wildfire risk, as many are covered in non-native fire-prone grasses. How to restore agricultural production to these lands in a way that also contributes to food sovereignty and climate change resilience is a major concern. In Hawaii, indigenous agroforestry systems were a central component of resilient food systems for nearly a millennium prior to European contact. This study by Kirishima et al. Also showed agroforestry systems produce more food than lo'i kalo. ʻŌiwi agroforestry is a system and practice of planting crops with trees that is rooted in indigenous ancestral practices and worldviews, includes a diversity of native and culturally important species, and contributes to food sovereignty, in part by producing food for local communities. Indigenous agroforestry systems are among the most biodiverse ecosystems in the Pacific, so conserving and restoring these systems is important for biodiversity conservation as well. But colonization, dispossession of native lands, and plantation era agricultural management practices, among other factors, have resulted in a huge decline in this form of land stewardship or ecosystems throughout Hawaii. So reforesting fallow agricultural lands previously devoted to plantation agriculture with and restoring invasive species dominant forests to indigenous agroforestry has immense potential to increase food sovereignty, native biodiversity, and resilience to climate change. And there are a lot of practitioners already doing this work of restoration of or through agroforestry. And ensuring that efforts to promote and expand agroforestry translate to socially just landscape change requires a critical understanding of how agroforestry is already occurring today. So first, I want to give a little background and context on this supporting ʻŌiwi agroforestry by looking at a statewide qualitative study I led, looking at the drivers of and constraints to transitions to agroforestry in Hawaii. I carried out this work in particular with MÂLA Wong and Tamara Tickton. So we know that transitions to agroforestry fundamentally involve people changing the structure and level of biodiversities in landscapes. So as you see pictured here, like planting trees, planting other woody plants, and making those sorts of decisions. But these stewardship decisions about what to plant are also made in complex political economic contexts that are mediated by power relations. So for example, a person's decision to practice agroforestry can be affected by their access to capital, land, and labor, what regulations are present, and their social and economic power. So we designed a qualitative study to understand the drivers and constraints to agroforestry practices and who gets to practice, paying attention to power dynamics and political economic context. We reached out to folks already practicing any form of agroforestry and then conducted semi-structured interviews on Zoom. We transcribed and coded these interviews, came up with preliminary results, and then shared those back in a focus group to refine the results with practitioners that we interviewed. In total, we interviewed 38 practitioners from 31 sites, which we defined as a land parcel stewarded by individuals, families, businesses, or nonprofit organizations. Some interviews included multiple stewards of one site. 50% of the practitioners we talked with self-identified as Kanaka ʻŌiwi. Most folks owned or co-owned at least part of the land they steward, and most sites were less than 20 acres. Most transitions to agroforestry of the folks that we interviewed, most of those transitions occurred when practitioners gained new access to former plantation agriculture or ranching lands that were fallow and covered in non-native grasses, shrubs, and or trees. All of these sites were very diverse, with different plants integrated at the plot level in multi-story systems for the most part. And here is a list of some of the major species, primary harvested species that were grown in a matrix of many native plants. And what we found in talking with these folks was first that their motivations for practicing agroforestry relate to two big areas: their values and the direct benefits of agroforestry. So these are the main dimensions of themes that emerged from the interviews. Importantly, that people's values related to conservation and the restoration of food sovereignty were a significant motivator for land use transitions to agroforestry, rather than production or economic goals being the primary motivator. In particular, restoring relationships were important, and then directive benefits were only brought up secondarily, and still most were non-economic. So I don't have time to go through all of the themes within each of these three dimensions, but I do want to show you part of the table briefly just to give you an idea of the complexity of people's motivations, as they can sometimes be collapsed into these big dimensions. It's hard to think about the specific reasons people gave. So the themes right now are listed in this table in order of the most referenced, within each dimension, and the themes with an asterisk were referred to in particularly relation to forests. So they were talking about forests when they said that theme. And so you can see that reversing both the ecological and social damage of plantation agriculture was the most referenced theme. And relatedly, bringing the native forest back was a really important motivator. Practitioners were also highly motivated by strengthening their communities. As one practitioner expressed, quote, "We're trying to elevate our community to the status of being able to be autonomous, to be able to be sovereign, and so we have to start with growing food." Direct benefits included personal health and well-being and the practicalities of reduced maintenance. Importantly, there were only a few references to direct economic benefits as a motivation for agroforestry. But these practitioners expressed a lot of challenges, some that are shared with other small, diversified agricultural practitioners in Hawaii, like access to capital, land, and labor, non-native or invasive plants, pests, and diseases. But there are also many unique constraints to this form of stewardship. So in this analysis, we looked specifically at those that were brought up as unique to agroforestry. And so these, again, are the main dimensions of those challenges. So many practitioners expressed how they fall through the cracks because systems for accessing land, capital, and markets favor short-term production and economic value, which doesn't align with their practices and values. For example, one person said, there's not many people that want to take up projects like this because it doesn't make that economics. So it's almost like you got to work with whoever can provide you with the capital and structure to really even get going. If I could do this in my own backyard, that would be ideal. Agroforestry not making the economics incorporates the tension practitioners face between finding secure long-term land access, having startup capital, and being able to keep up with maintenance and expenses while waiting for long-term benefits of trees. The other dimensions of themes included indigenous and local knowledge is not adequately valued. Institutions, including organizations, agencies, and also social norms and worldviews are siloed or separated between forestry and conservation and agriculture. And not enough appropriate information is accessible. So looking at, in particular, this indigenous and local knowledge not being adequately valued. One example of that was a practitioner expressed about a support organization, quote, "They basically have these cookbook recipes on how to responsibly manage land and deal with erosion and all of that. And some of it is good, but I think it just takes the creativity and some of the experience and maybe some of the wisdom out of managing something, some of the relationship, all of that stuff that's hard to touch and put your finger on, but that are maybe more important than just like everything must be 14 feet apart and here's your list of appropriate species." Other themes in this dimension included inadequate recognition of the important role that mahiʻai, or land stewards and food producers, serve as not only food producers, but also land, water, and biodiversity protectors. Additionally, a unique constraint to agroforestry is that institutions, including organizations, agencies, and also social norms and worldviews, are siloed or separated between forestry and conservation on one side and agriculture on the other. For example, one practitioner said, quote, "When you're talking to policymakers and they have no idea what you're talking about as far as agroforestry, it's very difficult for them to get attached to the idea that we need less leases extended. You know, for them, it's just like, well, why don't you just go do farming the way everybody else does farming?" Despite these obstacles, though, practitioners are persisting and observing the benefits of restoring these culturally important forests. Some of the top reference changes observed are an increase in soil health, greater number of native and culturally important plants, and enriched relationships between people and the places they steward. To understand how these practitioners were able to persist despite the obstacles, we coded the data with regard to this question. We found that access to offsite resources that are inequitably distributed shapes who can persist despite the obstacles. In particular, Native Hawaiian practitioners expressed having challenges in securing access to land, startup capital, and culturally appropriate support resources. The most referenced theme of how people persist were the ability to self-fund and to write grants. For example, one practitioner expressed, quote, "We were lucky because of our professional background that we can write grants. I mean, we never thought of grant writing as a thing, a skill to have, but I guess we were just used to being writers and whatnot, so we could write for grants, and that's a disadvantage that other farmers have." So overall, this study highlights a few important key takeaways, which are illustrated in this artwork by Tahina Kahikina. First, we found that agroforestry is intentionally chosen as a form of restoration and reclamation of sovereignty, not only as a means to production and economic benefits as a technical practice. In this way, for many of the practitioners we spoke with, both indigenous and non-indigenous, transitioning to agroforestry was a political act through which practitioners sought to reverse social and ecological damage. Practitioners chose agroforestry purposely as a form of ecological or biocultural restoration. The second piece of this is that this agroforestry as a term, as a field, faces an important contradiction. The same institutions that promote agroforestry also perpetuate the dominant systems of resource access, values, and silos that constrain agroforestry practitioners. So our findings really highlight the need to revise how agroforestry is framed in outreach policy and programs to be more inclusive of people trying to restore and adapt historical, indigenous, or ʻŌiwi in particular, agroforestry systems, rather than simply transition to agroforestry as a means to achieve simultaneous production, economic, and environmental benefits. Despite these challenges, though, people are making it work. But more support is needed to improve access to agroforestry transitions. Most importantly, restoring long-term land access that empowers indigenous practitioners, revaluing indigenous and local knowledge, and rebuilding resilient support infrastructure for these practitioners. So building off of this work and identifying these needs of more, in particular, more support for ʻŌiwi agroforestry practitioners, my collaborators, Leah Bremer, Natalie Kirishima, Miley Wong, Tamara Tickton, and I wrote and received funding from UHC Grant and Kamehameha Schools to co-develop and foster knowledge exchange between ʻŌiwi agroforestry practitioners. So I want to share a little bit about our journey in this project that is building on what we found in the first. So we started by bringing together practitioners from 14 Native Hawaiian-led organizations who do biocultural restoration or restoring cultural relationships to place, not just ecosystems, and grow food and other culturally important plants in mixed forest settings. And this first gathering was in April or spring of 2022 at Waipaw Foundation on Kauai. We planned a 3-day in-person gathering with field tours and facilitated discussions to support knowledge exchange. And a particular focus of this first gathering was knowledge exchange related to climate resilience. And part of this was that we had all of us convening this gathering had benefited from in-person knowledge exchange. And they can be really important for developing locally relevant solutions to common challenges and revaluing local knowledge and experience. So that was the context with which we saw this as an opportunity and this form of gathering and support. And the energy, the AHA had huge success. People, and part of this was the timing in spring of 2022. We had all not been doing much in-person gathering. And so people were really craving that. But in particular, we had a lot of great feedback about the space, just having the space for folks to connect with each other and build pilina. So all of the participants who responded to the survey after the first in-person gathering expressed that the most useful part of the AHA was networking and pilina building. For example, one practitioner expressed that the most useful part of the AHA was, quote, networking with other practitioners, learning from them, and being inspired by them. At this gathering, we connected with folks who we anticipate partnering and sharing knowledge with for years to come. with mutual benefit both to our organization and others. This led us, with our initial seed funding, to host 2 more gatherings, both at ʻŌiwi on Oahu and Laupaʻi in Kona on Hawaiʻi Island. And in these gatherings, we iterated in each one to build on what people's feedback was. But much of the time was spent in doing hana together and having that time for informal exchange of ideas and knowledge. And then also, as you see pictured here at ʻŌiwi, having some time for a more facilitated discussion where we sit down together and identify topics and work together to discuss them. And so some of these facilitated discussions related to financial mechanisms for agroforestry, climate change resilience, and then also visioning what this, if there was an interest in continuing these gatherings, and what priority activities might be for this hui. And out of the discussions of these first 3 gatherings, participants articulated what unites them and found that there was a lot of common ground and a lot of interest in continuing working together because of the benefits that they saw of being together. So the first theme of what people said united them was that we grow food and restore aina, people and relationships, linking farms and forests. So similarly echoing that motivation that this is a form of biocultural restoration. It's not just about food production, it's food sovereignty and about restoration of place. Second was that we collaborate and share across moku. Our diversity is our strength. And so this was something these folks come from, and we'll see in the next slide, but from 4 different islands across Hawaii. And so the ability to connect with each other across those spaces was really unique, and they saw that as a strength. We are ʻŌiwi growing ʻŌiwi, uplifting lahui to kukulu ea and lead. And we're cultivating the next generation of mahiʻai. And then in this 3rd gathering, the practitioners also identified a name for this hui as MΑLA ʻŌiwi, MALA standing for Mahiʻai Limalau Aloha. So the current members include agroforestry practitioners from ʻŌiwi-led organizations that are shown here on the map. And this hui collectively stewards approximately 6,000 acres of land and engages over 6,500 community visitors annually. We have now gathered biannually for 2 years and to learn from each other, discuss priority issues, and build pilina or connections with each other. Some of our recent and ongoing activities in the 3 AHA that we've had since those first 3, both fall 2023 at Ho'olu Aina on Oahu and spring of this year at Hui Mau, and then also fall of this year at Ma'o on Oahu. And ongoing work in between has been hiring our first staff person, as I mentioned, Linnea, and developing a governance structure, mission, vision, and membership process. So taking these lessons that we've learned in the pilina that has been built and starting to make a vision for how this hui can continue to support not just the practitioners who are involved now, but also other members of this agroforestry and restoration community of folks doing aloha aina. Another project, another thing that has come up is reclaiming this narrative of agroforestry. So agroforestry being a very recently coined Western term and that is now being used used to name indigenous practices. And so thinking about in Hawaii in particular, how can we reclaim that word and show that these are indigenous practices. And so one part of that is a collective film project, a creative film project with Aina Paikai, stay tuned for more on that in the coming months. And then we've also been working together to develop indicators of restoration success to track the collective impact of this hui. So a couple of key takeaways from so far from this really early work with MΑLA ʻŌiwi is that these in-person peer-to-peer knowledge exchanges are really important. And we see that in other spaces in agriculture, and there's lots of networks. But one thing that has really come out of this is that there's a huge value to creating kanaka ʻŌiwi spaces for this form of restoration. There are huis for like limu hui and for local ia, but for folks who are really, as I brought up in the challenges, straddling these different silos of forestry and conservation and agriculture, we've heard from folks that this space is important in that way, and that this form of restoration, having a place where they can talk about their practices and the unique challenges of bridging that conservation and agriculture space. And then second is that MALA ʻŌiwi right now is this network of agroforestry practitioners from ʻŌiwi-led organizations who are taking collective action to realize this potential of ʻŌiwi agroforestry. As we saw early on in the work from Natalie Kurashima, this was a very extensive and very important part of the landscape of Hawaii. And so this hui is really working to reconnect that and overcome the barriers together by working together and taking collective action. And efforts of this hui and others who are working to support ʻŌiwi agroforestry practitioners can really help to expand and promote and make sure that agroforestry is translated into, these efforts to promote agroforestry are translated into socially just landscape change. So if you're interested in learning more about agroforestry in Hawaii and hearing the stories of these practitioners in their own words, I encourage you to check out this series of educational case study videos and publications that Tressa Hoppy, Maile Wong, and I made in collaboration with practitioners with funding from the USDA National Agroforestry Center. You can find the 7 videos on YouTube by searching Hawaii Agroforestry Case Studies, and there are also accompanying 2-page written case studies available on my website and translated into Olelo Hawaii, Spanish, and Ilocano. I want to mahalo all the folks who've contributed to this work and all of the various funders. And with that, I think we have plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. So do we have any questions? Feel free to jump on, turn your camera on, turn your mic on. I know that I'm very excited to see the future of this hui and the work that you all are doing. Susan.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I couldn't find the raise hand button. I don't know why.
That's okay.
Anyway, great presentation. So
thanks.
It sounds to me like there's just a lot of barriers for agroforestry, and seeing my own son who's trying to be a farmer and make a living at it, it seems almost impossible. And, you know, these people work so hard. You know, working the land is not an easy job. And I'm wondering at a 1,000-foot level, what are your thoughts about the biggest barriers to people actually being able to accomplish successful agroforestry, meaning it's economically viable and can provide for communities? You know, what are those, and are there ways we can start making those happen, whether it's policies in the county or laws, or, you know, I just want to hear your opinion on that.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is super challenge. Like there's so many challenges, and I think, you know, revisiting all the slides and looking at all of this, it just, you know, brings up all of these people who have become really close with, and knowing like how much they do every day. It's really significant. I think, you know, the big ones, as I mentioned, which is for all agriculture or community stewardship in Hawaii, is that land access. Seems like a big key. And in the interviews that we had done, I think I mentioned that many of them did own or co-own some of their land, and that's just like, that's part of how it works, because without that, you're not really, like, you're not even able to come to the table if you don't have a long-term land stewardship agreement that's really secure. Then you're not going to be doing this form of like forest work. And then, yeah, I think in terms of the economic viability of it, I think, you know, the people who are kind of making it work is either grant funding or having really key value added products. If you're not on the nonprofit, if you're trying to go at it for profit version, which I'm sure your son is familiar with, like how you can't just sell your cacao beans, like you have to be the one who's also making the chocolate to really get that economic value from it. I don't know, I think there are opportunities as the work that these folks are doing is so much more than just farming or just producing a product, whether it's a forest product or a more conventional row crop, that I think maybe there's opportunity for different payments for like, I think one option is exploring what those different payments are for some of the other stewardship contributions that folks are making, whether that's water or to, you know, water conservation or biodiversity conservation. Yeah, I mean, on that high level, it's it's a big question.
Yeah, I'm curious about incentives provided by the county, you know, because everyone talks about this as something we need to do, but it's not viable, and no one's going to go into this field if they can't make it. And, you know, I know the farm bill they're trying to get put forward right now, and hopefully there's some incentives in there. But yeah, it just really feels like the political will needs to shift a little bit. And I even know on the Big Island, there's some proposals right now to, you know, only support people doing agriculture on their lands if they're making money. And I know a lot of people really just do agriculture to support their families and their friends, and so they're not making money at it. And so that's really a disincentive for that. And, you know, so I feel like in some ways we're going backwards in some of the rules people are making rather than forward. And it's just, it is really frustrating. And I'm sure you must be frustrated too, but a lot of it's so much political will, and it's not really our area of expertise. So I guess maybe more collaborations with, you know, councilmen or lawmakers or the ledge session, you know, might really help this you know, become more viable in the future.
Right. Yes. And there are some existing federal payment programs that are maybe not being accessed as much as they could be for this. And so for this form of stewardship, so that is a potential area, like the environmental quality incentives program through NRCS. So it's possible like that. And then, I mean, that's some of the future work that we're hoping with collaborators at the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization. They're going to be looking into these land use transitions from fallow ag land and opportunities for payments. And so hoping to include agroforestry, some investigations into like what would it take and what would those payment programs look like. And then, yeah, kind of communicating with policymakers about that, if we can kind of do the background science on it.
Oh, that's great. That's really good.
Yeah, it's there's some hopefulness in it. And then I think there's, you know, also changing how like what does it mean to be economically viable? Like you said, like not everyone wants to, I mean, because this is a very values based and like restoring relationships kind of practice for many folks. Selling something isn't necessarily the top priority. It's like stewarding aina, aloha aina, and cultivating a next generation. And so people are finding like other ways to get paid for that work, whether it's like taking over contracts for mowing or stewardship in those services, where then they have that money to use for their own products, and that's similar of like off-farm jobs. So a lot of people are doing this as their quote unquote hobby. And the education component, and so seeking funding to educate and cultivate that next generation while doing the same time. That can also be a barrier because you're spending a lot of your time on that education piece and not on the stewardship piece. But strategic engagement of community volunteers is a big part of it. Yeah.
Well, thanks, so thanks for your work.
Yeah. Thanks, Susan.
So we do have a question in the chat. The comment is, mahalo nui loa for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering if the process for organizations seeking membership in MΑLA ʻŌiwi has been finalized or open for inquiries.
We're definitely open. At our last AHA, we were able to come up with a first draft of a membership process. And then when we meet in the spring, we'll hopefully be working on that more. One of the things that held us back from continuing to move forward with like letting in new members is making sure that from this original, the folks who are involved now have committed made a huge time commitment to being a part of this hui and showing up at these, they're not insignificant gatherings. These are 3 to 4 day in person, taking time, and they don't get paid. So it's time away from their jobs or their work to come and meet together. And so honoring that contribution and the space that's been created, to spend some more time with this hui to do some visioning of what do they see as the future of MΑLA ʻŌiwi and where they want to go with this, and then take next steps on membership. But certainly if you're interested, please reach out to me or Linnea, and we're keeping a running list of folks who are interested in being contacted when we do open membership. And the hui is really trying to, a part of this process of visioning and thinking about how can we support a greater number of ʻŌiwi agroforestry practitioners in the meantime. So would love to connect. Feel free to reach out to me. And Linnea is here. So yeah, thanks Linnea for dropping your email in the chat.
That is wonderful. Do we have any more questions? If not, we can close down the webinar. If you do think of any other questions, let us know, and we can connect you with Zoe, or you can contact her directly. But again, mahalo Zoe for coming and doing this presentation for us. Mahalo everyone for coming to our last HETF webinar for the year, and keep a lookout for our future webinars.